Hello everyone, welcome to today's Turn 2021 Ecosystem Observations webinar series. And we've named our webinar series after Lynn Beazley, and I believe Lynn Beazley is online today. So if you'd like to say hi, Lynn, that would be really nice.
Hi everybody, so great to be here and so looking forward to what sounds a marvellous session.
Thank you, Lynn. So today we're going to be talking about Australian sea change phenomenon and ecosystem monitoring perspective. And first I'd like, however, to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians throughout Australia, New Zealand and all nations. We honour their profound connections to land, water, biodiversity and culture, and pay our respects to the elders, past and present and emerging. We have many people online today from many countries, and it's really great to see you all here today. And Turn, of course, is happy to host this program. We're one of the Australian national research infrastructures enabled by the IMOS program, and we have quite a few partners involved in Turn. Today's presenters have got quite a few skills, and I hope that you've been able to read their biographies in the notes that have been when you registered, and they're also online. We have three speakers, Dr. Michelle Heupel, and Michelle is the director of IMOS, which is another one of the national research infrastructures of Australia. So being in charge of the integrated marine observing system means that Michelle looks after Australia's greatest effort that's out there looking at oceans and coasts and recording the data about changes that are happening. We're also very pleased to have Dr. Elisa Bayraktarov, and she is currently the EcoCommons Program Manager at Griffith University. But Lisa has got an eclectic background. She's very much an ecologist and has been involved in programs such as the Threatened Species Hub before she went to the EcoCommons program. And we also have Sharon Tickell, who works at CSIRO. She's the Coastal Informatics Team Leader with, in the Oceans and Atmosphere Business Unit. We're hoping that you'll come up with lots of questions during our webinar today as you listen to the speakers. Please put them in the Q&A section, not in the chat section. What I'd like you to do in the chat section is put where you're listening from, whose country you're on. I myself am sitting on the Turrbal and Jagera lands in Brisbane, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm now going to hand over to Michelle to take us off, and Michelle will then introduce Elisa, and Elisa will introduce Sharon, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end of the program. So here we go. Thank you.
Thanks, Beryl. I'm just jumping between screens. All right, hopefully everyone can see that now. Thank you for having me today. I want to give you an indication of what we're looking at in IMOS, in the Integrated Marine Observing System, and how we think we can help connect communities and use sustained observing to help us understand what's happening in coastal habitats. So why is coastal observing important? Well, over 90% of Australians live within 100 kilometers of our coast. So effectively, this is where we live, we work, and we play. In addition to us using these spaces very heavily, coastal habitats support some really key ecological communities. So all of our mangrove habitats and our seagrass systems are in these areas, and they support a range of communities of animals and plants that rely on those systems. We build our houses and infrastructure near the coast. We have a lot of businesses, ports, fishing, tourism that operate in our coastal region. And we go there for recreation, to use the beaches and enjoy the environment. So in short, these regions are really critical to our way of life. They're critical to our food security, and they're critical to our well-being. So, what do we need to know about coastal monitoring, or why do we do this? This is a slide that I borrowed from Dan Iridikonu in the Victorian Coastal Monitoring Program. And I've borrowed this because they've done a really nice job of capturing sort of what they call the cause, the hazard drivers, and the coastal hazards. The causes for a lot of what we're going to see in this space are coming from climate change, as many of you will know. Sea level change and increased storm activity are going to influence these driver things. So sea level storm tides, currents, waves and swells, and the movement of sediment around the coast. And those things will lead to potential coastal hazards or coastal issues that we will deal with as communities. So the implications of coastal processes, those of you that live in Australia will have seen these images on the news. Coastal erosion is already an issue in Australia, and it's one that's likely to increase in the future. We will also have sea level rise lead to inevitable inundation of our coastal areas and our coastal cities. So these processes will affect our homes, our livelihoods, and our communities. Now, as scientists, we know beaches and coastlines are dynamic. We know these systems change. But the issue is that we don't really have the data to know how much they're changing, predict where they're going to change, and use that to help us plan and understand what our systems will look like in the future. Most of the existing data that we have in these areas is really fragmented and localized. So it's designed to help a local region understand what's happening rather than understanding the broader scale processes and the broader scale impacts and influences. Coastal inundation, as I said, will be a problem around Australia. These images here come from Coastal Risk Australia, where they modeled what high tide would look like in 2100 based on a sea level rise of about 0.7 of a meter. So you can see that there is the potential for really widespread issues, not just in one part of Australia, but all around the country, from regional places all the way into some of our major cities. So these are problems that we're going to have to deal with and things that we should be thinking about how we plan and how we go forward. So who needs to understand these coastal processes? A lot of people need to understand this. The Bureau of Meteorology needs this kind of information to help with their weather and climate forecasting. Coastal and city planners want to know where these effects are going to happen and how reliably and often they're going to happen. State and local governments, emergency services who often have to deal with these storms and understand where changes are going to occur. Finance and insurance industries are very interested in understanding how these changes might affect their portfolios. Coastal industries and businesses, indigenous communities who live near the coast, and homeowners, beach users, just the general public. This is a really pervasive issue that affects a lot of us because we are such a coastal driven community. There have been calls in the past for nationally coordinated approaches to sustained observing, but as I said, most of the existing data we have and the modeling is really collected at local or state levels. We don't have a lot of coordination and we don't have a national approach to this. Despite that, the National Marine Science Plan and Marine Nation 2025 recommended that we create a comprehensive national observing system that covered the open ocean into the coastal and littoral zones, and even put out a white paper on the establishment of a national coastal observing facility. The National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy, which funds TURN and IMOS, in their last roadmap called for an expansion of IMOS into coastal and estuarine waters. Engineers Australia submitted to that roadmap calling for coastal observing to be a key national priority. And there have been a number of groups that have advocated for increased wave data to be used to understand implications of waves on coastal systems. So the question then is, does sustained observing provide us a pathway to help understand what's happening in these systems and connect groups and communities together to better understand what's happening now and what these systems may look like into the future? So to talk about that, I want to give you a quick background on the Integrated Marine Observing System for those of you that aren't familiar with it. As Beryl said, we're a sister capability to TURN in the NCRIS program. We're a collaboration of 7 main partners based around Australia and 4 associate participants. And like TURN, we're a research infrastructure. So our job, our remit, is to collect systematic and sustained ocean observations and make that data openly accessible and available for scientific research and other uses. And we do that through hosting the Australian Ocean Data Network. So all of the data we collect is delivered through their portal. So what you see here on the left, excuse me, is sort of the breadth, not sort of, it is the breadth of the data that is served through IMOS. What we've got here is the orange lines indicate ships of opportunity. The green lines are animal tracking, animals fitted with CTD sensors to collect oceanographic data. The yellow mist there are ocean profiling floats, and then the red squares indicate where we have other infrastructure around the country. And that infrastructure ranges from open ocean deep water moorings through to underwater vehicles, animal tracking, and things much closer to the coast like coastal radar systems. Again, with all of that data delivered through the AODN data portal. So how can we apply what we're doing in, sort of in the ocean and reaching in towards the coast? IMOS has already some existing capability around wave buoys. As I said, we operate vehicles like gliders and we have radar. We also use a lot of satellite remote sensing data in our program, and we employ ships of opportunity that are moving through these areas. But we do need additional capability. Our oceans are a big place, our coasts are equally large, and we can't cover everything and we can't be everywhere. And what we know already is that we need more wave data, particularly close to the coast, and we need more ocean current data. We need to understand sediment transport. So where will we have deposition and where will we have erosion? Nearshore temperature is really important for modeling of these systems and understanding change in the systems. And then understanding biodiversity status and trends is also really valuable, because as these coasts change, it will change these key ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass beds, which will have implications for the species that rely on those habitats. So what sort of capability do we have nationally within and beyond IMOS? As I've said, we have wave buoys, and we need that information to help monitor wave height, direction, and sea surface temperature. There are groups that are already doing coastal imaging, so using things like video and fixed scanning LiDAR to characterize the cross shore profile, look at the beach width, look at the slope, understand the sand volume in those areas. There are citizen scientist groups working in Victoria doing coastal drone surveys and using targets to enable time series data of beaches and look at sections of coast and how they change pre and post storms. And then, of course, we have satellite data, which gives us a much broader coverage, national scale and over broad temporal scales as well, to do habitat mapping and look at changes in dynamics. We have all of these capabilities that we can start to tie together. As I said, IMOS has started working into wave buoys a reasonable amount to try and fill that gap. And one of the elements of that has been to test some low-cost wave buoys primarily in WA and Victoria. These are smaller units that can be deployed more easily close to the coast. And part of this trial has been to determine how effective these will be and whether they will give similar data to the larger, more expensive infrastructure that we typically use offshore. What you can see down here in the bottom right-hand side of this slide is the red line and the blue line are the low-cost buoys that we've been trialing, and the black line is the expensive offshore floats that we normally use. So you can see that they're tracking really well in the data they deliver, and this gives us a lot of hope that we can employ this smaller, lower-cost infrastructure to help observe closer to the coast. And these data come in real time. So if you go to the Vic Waves or the WA Waves pages, you can actually see the data coming in off these test sites. IMOS, as I said, also has, we have these offshore wave buoys. We have some deep water wave buoys off the coast of Queensland. We're trialing the low-cost wave buoys. And we also just entered into a project in partnership with the Australian Research Data Commons to create a national database of wave observations that will serve through the AODN. I'm not going to go through this diagram on the right, but this is just an indication of the thought that's gone into how we pull together data that the states are collecting or other institutions or industry, along with the data that IMOS is collecting to help serve that into a national repository. Ultimately, the objective of a lot of this is to try to create some data streams that we can integrate together. So by integrating coastal observing data, we can value add to what we've collected, and we can answer more complex questions. This slide shows some images from our ocean current program where we do exactly that. We layer together data from a range of our capabilities to help understand what's happening in the system as a whole. And this kind of information is really valuable for coastal planning, weather forecasting, emergency services, industry, etc. And if we can connect the observing that we're doing around Australia, and if we can take a national approach, these are the kinds of things that we can achieve when we start integrating. So just quickly to conclude, as I've said, our current coastal observing is fairly ad hoc and uncoordinated. It's designed to meet local needs, which really impedes our ability to share data and our capacity to scale up and understand things at a broader level. We need to understand those broad scale processes and the storm events that we have continuing to come, because it's crucial to defining the effects that will happen in our coastal systems and our homes and cities. This coordinated approach would underpin improved modeling and forecasting and support decision-making and planning for our cities and our homes going forward. So the ability to integrate data from states, industry, citizen scientists, and research will create synergies and outputs that we have not previously been able to do, and gives us a lot of power and new opportunity. So just in closing, I would leave you with my message that I think it's time for us to really harness and try to integrate our capabilities across a range of sectors and areas so that we can all collectively do more. And I will say thank you very much, leave you with my contact details, and hand you over to Elisa.
Hi folks, let me just quickly share my screen. There we go. Hopefully this is coming up now. Alrighty, thanks Michelle. What an interesting talk, and I'd really like to give you a bit of a different perspective on why observational records and monitoring our marine coastal habitats is so important. And that's because they actually inform conservation actions. And marine coastal restoration is such a conservation action that people are moving towards. And in order to plan better projects for conservation and for restoring the oceans and coasts, we just need to get better at getting all the data that already exists and pulling it all together. So I'll talk to you about what marine coastal restoration is here, and what its motivations are, as well as how expensive it is and how likely it is to succeed. And while I'm currently the program manager of the EcoCommons, this work that I'll be showing you here has been mainly developed at the University of Queensland. So that's the Global Change Institute and the Center for Excellence for Environmental Decisions, and on a secondment with CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere. But let's ask ourselves first, what is marine coastal restoration? Well, the Society for Ecological Restoration defines ecosystem restoration as the process in assisting the recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And if you are a visual person like myself, think of ecological restoration of something that will get you from here to something that looks more like that. And as Michelle mentioned, coastal habitats are really highly important, highly productive. Many people actually depend on them. In some lower income countries of the world, actually coastal populations depend on those ecosystem services provided by these coastal ecosystems just to stay alive. But there are also some national and international targets. That is, we as member of the United Nations have an obligation to restore terrestrial and marine habitats for our biodiversity targets, but also for our sustainable development goals. And the United Nations General Assembly actually recently declared that we've entered the UN decade on ecological restoration. So this is as of 2021, and I can tell you that the oceans are going to play a big part in it. So now you might be asking yourself, how do actually people restore the ocean? And well, let's have a look at the 5 most popular ecosystems and how people have been restoring them. So coral reefs, everybody likes coral reefs. So people restore damaged reefs, damaged by, well, mass coral bleaching events, climate change, storms, perhaps ship grounding, by applying a number of techniques, for instance, direct transplantation of coral colonies from one reef to another that has been degraded. And more elegant approach would be to apply, to use the larval enhancement approach, where actually larvae from corals are being reproduced in the lab and brought back to rejuvenate the degraded reefs, but also coral gardening, where small pieces, fragments of corals are grown in so-called coral nurseries, and then once they reach a certain size, they are brought back to repopulate degraded reefs. And also substrate addition, where there is no substrate for corals to settle on. Sometimes construction of an artificial reef can help as well. Seagrass are being restored by transplanting seagrass shoots or mats to degraded areas, but also seeding of seagrass seeds has been quite heavily used in Western Australia. And sometimes people have also used deployed hessian bags that help seagrass shoots to anchor to the sediment. With mangroves, it's a completely different story. So here restoration projects usually involve the collection and planting of wild seedlings with the help of lots of volunteers and community groups and over large areas. So this is perhaps the only ecosystem where really large scale restoration interventions have been carried out in more than 10 hectares of areas. And for salt marshes, usually the restoration consists of two phases. The first phase is the construction phase, where the natural habitat and its hydrology, the water cycle, is being restored, and then salt marsh vegetation is being planted. And finally, oyster reefs are being restored by the deployment of natural or artificial substrate where oysters can settle. Sometimes people apply reared, in aquaculture, reared oyster larvae to populate those reefs, but also no harvest sanctuaries have been quite effective in bringing the oysters back. Now, why I mentioned to you that I wanted to talk to you about the motivations of restoration. And you might ask yourself, why should somebody be studying motivations? Well, let me tell you that this is actually a quite important question, given that restoration is usually carried out by individuals, and individuals are humans. And then motivations are the needs, desires, wants, or drives within an individual. And it's the process of stimulating people to action to reach goals. So we carried out a global literature review and extracted data on costs, feasibility, and survival of restored organisms, and developed a database on marine coastal restoration projects that was supposed to guide future restoration interventions. And we updated, so this database was created in 2016 and then updated in 2018. And once we've updated it in 2018, we also extracted information on motivations and also what metrics people were reporting to track progress of the restoration, and also what outcomes they were reporting on. And we should, thinking about restoration, it's quite important to realize that it's actually a quite complex problem. And there are lots of stakeholders that have many different motivations. And for instance, there is an ecological perspective where, for instance, scientists are interested in data, models, concepts, or understanding the ecosystems better. So many scientists have heuristic or experimental rationale or biotic motivations. They want to see the biodiversity enhanced. And from a socioeconomic context, people are usually interested in the value that ecosystems can bring, ecosystem services. So they see the restoration side as an asset, so they have private sector responsibilities. And from an institutional context, there are governments that need to fulfill their mandates. So there is another public sector responsibility. And finding this little sweet spot just in the middle is inherently difficult because everybody has different ideas about what restoration is good for. Now, doing the exercise at looking at what's the motivations that people report when they talk about marine restoration research, we observed 5 different categories: the biotic, experimental, idealistic, legislative, and pragmatic motivations. And we found that the biggest motivation to restore those ecosystems, this is this aquamarine sort of bar here, were experimental reasons. So people wanted to improve the restoration approach and answer questions of ecological concern. Now, there was also a component of a biotic component. So people wanted to increase the biodiversity at a restoration site. And this was apparent for seagrass, salt marsh, mangroves and corals, but not for oysters. And this might be hinting that the techniques used to restore oyster reefs might still be yet to mature, while the other ecosystems already are looking into how do we get ecosystem services out of this restoration. This was actually a quite important component for the mangroves, where many people were looking into enhancing the ecosystem services like coastal protection, fisheries, and others. And I should mention that social reasons, like, for example, education, awareness, things like that have been quite important for mangroves, but not as visible for the other ecosystems. So now you may argue, but surely published literature is biased towards experimental work. So it doesn't really reflect what's happening on the ground. So in 2018, I started a study where I interviewed 25 coral reef restoration practitioners from 5 Latin American countries that run 11 coral reef restoration projects. And I asked them about what motivated their projects. So I found that both the biotic and the experimental rationale were equally important as a primary motivation to restore. And the biotic rationale was the main secondary rationale, and often the projects also followed a legislative rationale, such as people were restoring for biodiversity offset. Now, let's talk about what marine coastal, how expensive marine coastal restoration is and how successful it is. So this diagram here is showing the costs to restore 1 hectare of coral reef, seagrass, mangrove, salt marsh, or oyster reef habitat. And it appears coral reefs are the most expensive to restore with $165,000, followed by seagrass with $100,000. And salt marshes and oysters are about $77,000 US per hectare. And the least amount of funding or the cheapest ecosystem to restore have been the mangroves, with $9,000 to restore 1 hectare of mangrove habitat. And it was quite interesting to see that usually reported restoration projects occurred at very small scales. I mean, look at this, coral reefs, that's a very small experimental scale. And only for mangroves, we could actually see that large scale restorations have happened over larger areas. Now, if you can't really tell anything about what a hectare is, just imagine that a soccer field is about 0.7 hectares. So that's the median value of how large the salt marsh restoration areas have been, a little bit less than a soccer field. And we also looked at the project time. So documented project times took between 1 and 2 years of time, while probably the recovery of a whole ecosystem could probably take about a decade to centuries. Finally, the success measured as survival of restored organisms was highest for coral reefs with 65 and salt marshes, followed by oyster reefs and mangroves, and the least survival was reported for seagrass habitat. Now, the most important question on whether success actually depended on the money spent, and the answer is no. We couldn't really find a correlation between survival of restored organisms and the reported restoration costs. And unfortunately, we were also not able to find economies of scale, which may mean that restoration projects did not get cheaper with larger areas. But then what's the secret for success? Okay, I'm going to give you the secret on how to develop what was the same thing that restoration projects had in common that actually succeeded. And that was a recent collaboration with CSIRO, John Cook Uni, and Duke Uni in the US, where we looked at those successful outliers in my diagrams. We tried to look for a repeated pattern about why those projects were actually successful. And we found that the largest, cheapest, and most successful projects actually had 4 things in common. So the first thing is that people that carried out the restoration projects always looked at the specific environmental conditions at that location where they were restored. And they always used low-cost technology that was cheap and scalable. And they were always implemented by huge partnerships of people from different diverse organizations. So collaborations between research, government, and NGOs were quite common. And also they always incorporated lessons learned from the past, so active adaptive management. And I'd like to acknowledge a long list of wonderful colleagues throughout the years, and also the organizations on the Latin American paper. I've colored them in NGO, tourism, industry, academia, and philanthropy, just to give you an idea about the diversity of those stakeholders. And thank you very much. So we'll have some questions at the end, but let's move to Sharon Tickell, who will tell us about the current state and accessibility of Australia's coastal data services.
Thanks, Elisa. Just let me find my slides. I hope they've come up now. So to take a slight step back from where the data is going and how the data is generated, I'm going to close this set of talks by talking about the data services, which are the method by which the data gets from A to B, and also to C, D, E, F, and other letters through to Z. We have a lot of data services out there. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what they are, where you can find them, and what you can do with them once you've got them, plus where some of the gaps are that I'm hoping our future research efforts will address. So this is not a technical talk, but I'd like to begin by giving you some context and some definitions for the terms I'm going to use. So within the coastal research community in Australia, we've got several, well, 3 according to this diagram, categories of data service that are important and which are handled differently. The first category are spatial data services, so things that let you do internet maps, plus a lot of other things, but internet maps is the shiny one. They're usually they serve data that is a mixture of static data files, KML shapefiles, GeoTIFFs, and data in spatial databases. They use technologies that could be open source along the lines of the PostGIS database server and the GeoServer service. And they may also use commercial scale technologies like the Esri ArcGIS, like Oracle Spatial Database, and other things which are somewhat more tricky to maintain. They have a set of very standard interfaces that have been developed by the Open Geospatial Consortium over the years. And these use a bunch of acronyms starting with W. So web map services, web feature services, web coverage services. Those interfaces are very well supported in the research community. They're used by a lot of things outside the coastal space as well, of course. And there are client libraries to help you access that data. Second category of data service is the one that serves up research model results. So in the coastal space, that's things like e-reefs, it's things like the big climate models, it's the work that the Bureau of Meteorology do, and I'm sure many, many more of you who are both in this talk and in our field. It's usually file system-based data, multidimensional, and individual data files can be very large, upwards of 100 gigabytes per file, and file system collections can be enormous. So the e-reefs results collection is heading for 0.5 petabyte these days, and that is absolutely dwarfed by the climate model results. So you can't move them around. And the data services that you use to give people access to those include interfaces like OpenDAP and like an extension of the WMS Web Map service, which allows you to do things like choose a dimension and choose a timestamp. Third category of data service that I'm going to talk a little bit about are time series data. This is much less mature in the research context than some of the model and static map services. There is not yet a definite standard interface, though there are several emerging, and I'd love to hear of the ones that people are using. And time series data can be wildly divergent. It includes simple numeric data from sensors in the field. It includes image data. It includes streaming video and other things which provide all kinds of interesting challenges for your IT staff who are trying to store all of that. Time series data is much less likely to be open access than some of the other data types, largely because of the challenges around collecting it, around maintaining it, and around quality control, because a lot of it is collected in conditions where you have technology versus weather. In the coastal space, it's also technology versus the people who use that space. And in some parts of the country, it's technology versus crocodiles, which adds an interesting extra dimension to your fieldwork. And our esteemed colleagues at IMOS are doing incredible work to increase the amount of time series data we have available to us. It's a very rapidly changing field. The last critical component of a collection of data services is your metadata catalog, because without that, well, you've got very complicated numbers and some internet URLs. That metadata catalog has the descriptions of your data, the provenance for where that data was generated, how it may be used, and gives you links to the endpoints for your actual data services. Everything else in that diagram is platform specific, and I'm not going to go into details of those today. So once you know what a data service is, what other properties of it are important? I hope that all of you here are familiar with the FAIR principles for hosted data, which are markers of good quality research data that can be findable, can be accessible, can be interoperable, and can be reusable. And I have stolen those definitions from the ARDC, so please use them up if you'd like the long form version. Those data sets and those principles, though, are for individual data sets. And when you want to scale up to make lots and lots of data available, there are some additional properties in your data services that you need to be looking for. That includes things like service levels. How long will the data service exist for? How reliable is it? How will it stay up? How fast is it to retrieve data, particularly if you want to do decision support or anything else that requires quick turnaround? And is anybody maintaining it? If you're going to need the next generation of your interface in 2 years' time, will anybody make that happen? You need to look at the governance of your data service. So that includes who owns it, who maintains it, who pays for the hosting, who is allowed to add data to it. Does it belong just to one institution, or is it a community repository? And is anybody checking that the data that is added is actually useful data with quality control and proper metadata? Not to say that things which don't have all of those properties can't be useful, but it does tend to make them less reliable and rather trickier to use. The last thing you'll want to check for is end user support. And this is particularly critical where you are trying to build something on top of a data service, or you're trying to use very large quantities of data, like some of the data generated by the IMOS program. And that includes your ability to authenticate to the data if it's restricted. It includes your ability to ask for help, and it includes your ability to consume that data, particularly if it has a non-standard interface. So where do you start? This is where we come back to the data discovery portals that were listed on the architecture diagram on an earlier slide. And there are many data portals out there. I have a very non-exhaustive selection upon this page that are excellent places to start looking for Australian research data, and in a few cases, global data. So our hosts from Turn have an excellent data portal which contains a lot of terrestrial data. Anything that you can find in there is fair enough to be used in other applications. Similarly, IMOS runs the Australian Ocean Data Network, which is an invaluable resource of marine data and particularly marine observing data. The national map contains Australian government data, both from the federal government and from a bunch of state government departments, and things like power lines and whatnot. eAtlas is maintained by AIMS, so the Australian Institute of Marine Research, and is a collection of data services and data sets for tropical Australia, so tropical north, and a lot of the northern NERP and NESP research programs are publishing their data into that service. Within CSIRO, we have two large data catalogues. Data.csiro is our main data access portal, and it has an incredible amount of legacy data, but because of reasons which I won't go into in this forum, does not have a lot of our coastal data in it, because our coastal data services predate that portal being available to us. Where you will find the coastal data is the Marlin catalogue, which contains all of CSIRO's coastal marine and atmospheric data sets, including all of the data that comes off the research vessel Investigator from anybody that sails on that ship. The Kaleidoscope portal is fairly new, and I'm cheating here because that's also a CSIRO service. It contains some marine industry-based data sets, including some really useful things like fisheries boundaries, closures, and locations of submarine cables, and the other things that you may need to know when you're setting up a research project that will involve fieldwork. And then because not all of us do work in Australia-based things, we also have the UN Environment Program, which is the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, and Pangea, which is hosted in Germany, I believe, and is referred to as a world data catalogue that contains a lot of environmental data from all over the place. However, those portals often contain tens of thousands of data sets, can be tricky to find some. If you know exactly what you're looking for, there are a number of specialist data services where you can find that data directly. Some of these are non-standard, most of them are open, some of them are not. I have a quick selection for you here, which I won't read, but I will put the links up to you later. But they contain some really interesting things like the SDG 661 application, which is freshwater ecosystems. It's a global data service that offers things like mangrove data and coastal wetland extents. The Digital Earth Australia project within Geoscience Australia has land changes, including intertidal extent monitoring that's generated from remote sensing data. Bioplatforms.com is a very new platform that is still in beta, I believe, for genetic information, genomics information, and includes and will be the production portal for the Australian Microbiome Initiative. And then on the other side of the world and different sorts of data, again, we've got things like citizen science programs like coastsnap.com, which is asking people to take photographs of the coastline and monitoring changes based on that. Open Aerial Map, which is making global drone imagery available. And it's so new it still squeaks when it turns around. Australian CSIRO Agriculture and Climate Data Shop, which is starting to bring out commercial scale data for things like seasonal rainfall forecasts in collaboration with the Bureau of Meteorology. So once you find your data, how do you use it? So 3 major steps here. Once you found it, you need to find the metadata record. It should be easily accessible, and if it's not, your data set's crap, pick a different one. You need to check the access constraints on your data, make sure that it's suitable to use for your application. Almost all of the data that's available in public portals is open and free to use, but you do need to check for things like non-commercial licenses and for things like attribution requirements. Having found that, the really useful bit is the endpoint URL, which gives you the URL from which you can make data requests to that service. Once you have that URL, though, the way in which you consume that is so application dependent that it's a whole course on its own, and I'm not going to go into it here because the profit depends on how well you do that. And that is something that I think is one of the biggest opportunities in this whole ecosystem, is to improve the way that that is done. So moving on. So in addition to your data and your metadata, we also like to collect metadata, which is information about the projects that's generating that metadata and data, which can be an excellent way to find out where somebody's put the interesting bits. So this is a form of provenance information. CSIRO has attempted to collect it in the past. This hasn't been as well supported as we'd like due to complete lack of funding, but we've got a major upgrade planned in the next year or so. So you're welcome to check this out, and I'd be interested in being contacted by anyone that would like more information about that. And then you need to pull it all together. So within CSIRO, we are currently hosting the AusCoasts website and its selection of data services. This is a nearly 20-year-old collaboration with Geoscience Australia that has recently been transferred over to CSIRO hosting. My team is currently in the middle of doing a major upgrade on the back end of this, and we'll be adding a whole lot of data services to provide a home for the data that doesn't quite fall under IMOS's purview and doesn't quite fall under TERN's purview, including community information, coastal indicators, and all of the data that used to belong to the coastal facility, which closed some years ago. We will then be using this as the publication portal for our future coastal projects. So it will shortly, in the next year or two, contain a whole lot of data related to blue carbon around Australia, to restoration potential, and pretty much anything else we find interesting. So stay tuned. You will be hearing more about this from us once it's ready. It's spread out all over the metaphorical deck at the moment, but we look forward to working with the research community on this and expanding it in the direction that is most useful for all of us to go. So I'll leave us all with that, and with a list of the URLs for some of the important bits and the important starting points when it comes to using these services. We've come a long way in terms of making data available, making data public, making it described, and we've got a ways to go on making it able to be integrated and making it easy to use. I really look forward to having the opportunity to work with all of you to sort of resolve that situation in the next few years. Thank you very much, and I'll hand you back to Beryl.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and also to Michelle and Elisa. Fantastic talks. I'm waiting for some questions to come through in the Q&A section, but some people have emailed me already. And Sharon, since you were the last one to talk, I'll come up with a question that relates to you. So Michelle mentioned the need to combine and integrate our existing capabilities to get a better understanding of coastal dynamics and determine where we still have gaps. What do you think the technical gaps or barriers there are to being able to integrate the various coastal data services or to use them in virtual laboratories and other applications?
So I guess there's two categories of gap there. One is being able to automate that integration. So at the moment, if you point a data portal at a metadata catalog, it has no way of knowing which of the described URLs in that metadata are the ones that are useful, which ones make maps, and which ones make time series, because the metadata standards have not yet evolved across the community to be able to tell those two apart without having a human interpret that information. That is something many people are working on. It's being worked on in at least 6 different directions that I'm aware of. And I think some coordinated work on that would be great. And the other gap we have, so similar to scaling up the observational infrastructure, is the data delivery infrastructure. Once you start building a large-scale web application on top of research-grade infrastructure, that puts a lot of burden of effort and of maintenance on the people trying to maintain that service. It's difficult to fund because it's being used by different people. And just the sheer amount of hosting information, trying to find data storage for things like streaming video data is an interesting challenge. The astronomers have that problem in a much bigger way, of course, but the astronomers also throw away 99% of what they collect and have a dedicated high performance computing cluster, which is not really available to the sort of natural resource group with government funding. There's lots that can be done. There's some really, really exciting technologies in development, but it's going to take some coordinating, and we might need to pick a direction to go at first. And I'm sure Michelle has some comments on that topic as well.
Michelle, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think Sharon's picked up on a lot of the challenges that come in this space. And I agree completely that, you know, one of the first steps is for us to prioritize and figure out, okay, what are the key pieces of information that we have and that we need to bring together? And you can build from there, but it's, yeah, it's one of these, you know, how do you eat an elephant sort of scenarios where you just have to pick where to start and try to build it and maintain that momentum as you go.
That's great. And Colin McKay, you've asked, as citizen scientists, in an essential sense, we're beginning to accumulate large volumes of information and we await a unified metadata framework. It seems a metadata framework would seem to add convergence for our data. Where can I find the CSIRO model? That's back to you, Sharon, I think. Or
one question. So the way some of this is starting to emerge in the IT side of the research community is to make a registry of services. So I found a couple of these when I went searching last night, just for my list of data services I wanted to talk about. And they basically put a file up on GitHub and they take pull requests for people to add their server's endpoints into that file, which tells you where they are, which I think might be quite an interesting exercise. But there are hundreds and hundreds of services, some in better states of maintenance and repair than others. So we do need extra. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd really love to have a workshop discussion on it. I think it would be fascinating. For metadata in the CSIRO standard, the Marlin catalogue that the investigator uses the Marine Community Profile, which is a community metadata standard supported by GeoNetwork. But we also harvest data from everyone else. We harvest GA data, we harvest AODN data so that we can search it all in one place. And that includes things that use CCAN and things that use GeoNode, things that use a bunch of other metadata standards that we can make interoperate. It is a work in progress, and we'd love to know more about what people need from it, and we'll see what we can do.
That's great. Thanks, Sharon. I've got one for Elisa, if you're up for it, Elisa. Somebody wants to know how we know whether we're reaching national and international restoration targets. How can we track our restoration efforts? Do you have any answers for that one?
That's such a great question that there is no answer. So at the moment, we can't really track how we're progressing towards international and national standards, because some of the progress from restoration is published, but many of the restoration projects are submitted within reports that are not really visible to people who are integrating this information. So along this desire to create a new sort of research infrastructure, I would really wish to propose an idea to create a space where restoration data could be collated, interrogated, and visualized, but also is showing us how we're progressing towards national and international sort of targets. And yeah, I think this would be a great way where people who carry out restoration projects could submit this spatial information about what is the area, what's the extent, what's the habitat that they have restored into a big database that would enable us to visualize this data for Australia as a whole, and also towards progressing to our national and international targets.
Wow, that would be very powerful, wouldn't it? It actually leads into the next question, which I'm not sure whether Sharon or Michelle would like to answer, but how do people make their own data available via an existing service? Is that something that they can do through IMOS, Michelle, or is that Sharon? Have you got clues on that one?
There is still a lot of knowing who to ask in that answer and which sphere of influence your data falls under. For homeless data sets that involve the coastal space, Auscoast would love to talk to you, but there are economies of scale and maintenance and funding requirements that do come along with that, unfortunately. For observing data, I believe that one's yours, Michelle.
Yeah, look, we absolutely try to serve as much as we can through the AODN, but as Sharon has alluded to, these are big programs that require a team to actually maintain them. And unfortunately, we get far more requests than we can actually manage with the team and the funding scope that we have. So it is a priority, and it's actually one that the National Marine Science Committee is discussing at the moment. So how do we do a better job at this nationally, and are there ways that we can improve our ability to share and host data?
That's great, Michelle. And I just draw everyone's attention to the person who heads up our South African equivalent of an observatory system, who's put some very nice comments in about you. But while you're looking at that one, I have another question that's come in, and I think this one is perhaps best for Michelle. So the question's about, so we've got TURN and we've got IMOS. So what defines a coastal ecosystem? You mentioned, Michelle, that the last roadmap for infrastructure put the ball into the court of IMOS, but how far do you go out to blue water? How far do you go inland? How do we deal with this one? It seems to be a contested space. We not only have so many people living around the coast, making it very difficult to even carry out observations because it's all pre-owned land, etc. But how do we define the coast?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated question, Beryl, and I don't have an easy answer for you. You know, if you ask 10 different people how they would define the coast, I think you would get 10 different answers, you know, in the research community. So some will say it's near shore, some will say it's, you know, below a certain, you know, it's shallow water below a certain depth. Some would say, you know, it's where the water meets the land. Some would say it has to include, you know, the beach and the shoreline. So yeah, it's a really, on top of the fact that it all moves around with the waves and it changes, you know, our definition of that is equally enigmatic, I think.
Yes. So Sharon's put in a whole lot of information, which is very nice of you. Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to take that comment from Michelle as a prompt to wind up this afternoon. I was interested to see people putting into the chat where they were listening to this webinar from, and it seems that we have a very high dependence on the coast, just from where we're even viewing each other. So coasts are not going to go away. We do need to be interested in how to collect consistent data and integrate it about the coast so that we can safeguard the ecosystems and our own livelihoods and well-being. So I think this is a topic that was very deserved for the very first of the Lynn Beazley Ecosystem Observations webinars that we have started off. And I thank all of our speakers. So Michelle, Elisa, Sharon, pat yourselves on the back. Fabulous presentations. And I think that people will follow up with you. And I've put something in the chat to say that they can have a quick look at where you all live through your bios and get in touch with you. We do have just a quick announcement. I'm going to share a screen. I hope I'm going to share a screen. Yes, I'm going to share a screen to tell you that having done coasts this month, in 2 months' time, our next webinar is going to be on resilience in Australia's ecosystems, yet another incredibly important topic because we don't know whether things are able to bounce back if change and extreme events happen so rapidly. We don't know whether they're going to transition to something different. So I think that that's one that we should all be registering for. So stay tuned for our announcement of when registrations are open. So once again, thank you everyone for being online to listen. We will put a recording out a little later so that you can revisit some of the main points. And thank you to each of our speakers. It's a fabulous day. Thank you.